Hello, everybody out there on the internet, and now I'm trying to figure out how it is that Paula DeAngelis just left a message on the YouTube channel that we're broadcasting on before we actually started broadcasting. So I am completely confused. But apparently we're live and we're broadcasting on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And I don't know how Paula left a message minutes before we went live, but we'll maybe figure that out uh, at some point. And I blame the NSA, or there might be some other practical explanation for this. But in any case, oh, and I forgot to put a thing down there telling you what we're actually, who we're actually talking to. This is a highly professional operation here. And we are. This is Discussions with David, which comes to you on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook on various weekdays. Usually Tuesdays, Wednesdays, oftentimes Fridays. On Tuesdays, it's under the auspices of Peter Werby with Fifth Estate as it's Fifth Estate Live. But in any case, I interview people usually at 10 a.m. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and some Fridays, Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern. What's that? 6 p.m. GMT, usually, depending on the time changes or not. And today, I am very happy to be spending the hour with Jason Crane, and I'm just putting up the banner, which is going to go down there on the screen there, so we can actually see the name of the person we're talking to as well. And Jason is, I'm going to bring him on in a minute, but first I'm going to just like make a fool of myself a little more here. I first met Jason decades ago, in fact, when he was in one of his 40 different jobs, which is not 40 different occupations, but we're going to get into that. Anyway, 40, one of his former jobs as a union organizer was when we first met, when I was performing for folks that he was trying to indoctrinate. And we've been in touch ever since. And I think he's interviewed me as a journalist for most every outfit he has worked for in the past 20 years as a journalist, which is probably why he keeps on getting fired so much, or I don't know. But anyway, we're going to bring him on now and reverse our roles, which is always one of those fascinating things. You know, journalists are often the worst at being interviewed because they think they know all the questions that I should be asking them. Jason, it's great to have you on the show. Sorry about my completely botched beginning here, but we're really...
Oh, I think I was as much responsible for that as anyone. As I live in a van, and that's where I am right now, and I'm trying to steal Wi-Fi from the gym chain that I belong to, but apparently their Wi-Fi is too slow, so
Oh,
I had to
that's
switch to
great.
my phone. Yeah.
And that's a great, that the gym chain. I mean, that makes sense. Of course, you belong to a national gym chain. Is that right?
So
Is
I
it
can
a national
shower.
chain? So you can
Yeah,
shower.
exactly. Yep.
And
Yeah,
that's
that's
like,
the only regular access to showers on the road. Otherwise, it's kind of the sponge bath scene. So yeah, this does well for me, except that their Wi-Fi, I've now learned, is not robust enough to allow me to stream video shows from their
what
parking
about
lot.
what about truck stops? Do you ever go to truck stops and
I
use
do,
their showers?
but for what it costs to go to a truck stop shower once, you generally speaking can have almost an entire month membership for one of these gyms. So it's usually 13 or 14 bucks at a truck stop. It's about 20 bucks to have a national membership to one of these chains. So the math is in favor of the gym. But yeah, when there's no other option, well, when
As
there's no
long as
other
you want
option,
to
I'll
shower
usually be
more than
dirty.
4 times a month. That's
Yes,
yeah.
that's exactly right.
I know some people who would think that the truck stop is a better deal, but we
Yeah, no, I get it.
I think what you're doing, excuse me, with the with these morning updates on Instagram that I keep on tuning into, and I love the way I don't know if it's like if I'm actually tuning in every time you do it, or if Instagram has figured out that I want to see your updates, and so they show them to me first thing. But I've been every time I turn on Instagram out, there's another morning update. Which tells you that I do it not more than once or twice a day, you know. But it's it's wonderful, and I've often thought traveling and touring how I would love to do actually something exactly like what you're doing, you know, other than the concerts, but like, you know, doing everything else that you're doing with this traveling project, and it's just I love the morning updates. And can you talk about what you're doing? What is it? The morning updates. I mean, you take your slingshot organizer and talk about today in history, and you tell us what you're going to be up to for the day. And I just feel like I'm almost like there in the van with you, and I feel a bit sort of jealous, because I love being stuck in one place, but I also miss traveling.
Yeah, no, I bet this is a big shift in your life and in mine, but in opposite directions. So yeah, as you mentioned, I've moved about 40 times. I've lived all over the U.S. and I've lived in Japan a couple different times. And recently, I guess about 5 months ago, the long-term partnership that I had, like romantic partnership, dissolved. And when that happened, like a lot of people, when I no longer was in a place where I was splitting expenses with someone, I didn't really have enough money to have my own apartment. I didn't have a savings really. I'm kind of in the same financial boat as, as so many folks who are just paycheck to paycheck, except for the most part, I work for myself. So those paychecks even can be, a little dodgy in terms of their their frequency. So I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with myself, and kind of stumbled almost by accident onto the fact that a lot of people move into vehicles when they're in difficult financial straits. I actually was homeless once before and didn't have a vehicle back then. So, I was just traveling around kind of sleeping where I could and depending on the kindness of strangers and that kind of thing. But this time, due to the apparently, it looks like one time now, stimulus that we received, I bought an inexpensive van, a minivan, a 1999 Dodge Caravan is what I'm in right now. And I decided that I would just take to the road, which funnily enough, in 2012, I had a relationship I'd been in for quite a while ended. I was poor. I didn't have a place to live. And so I went on the road, but just like on buses and that kind of thing. So this is almost a mirror of that situation, except now I have a place to sleep inside, which makes so much difference in kind of my view of what it means to not have a fixed home, because rather than either depending on the kindness of strangers or sleeping in whatever public spot I could find to sleep, now I do have a safe place to sleep every night, which makes an
and
enormous
to keep
difference.
all your things, right? So I mean, because that's another thing,
Absolutely.
is not only having a safe place, but if for anybody that has even just done backpacking, let alone traveled in any form without a vehicle, you know how tiring it gets to carry a backpack or
Yeah.
any kind of bag. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I did the first time. Everything that I owned was in a backpack, and now I have more stuff, a lot less stuff than I normally have had in the last several years, but much more stuff than I had when I was doing it the other way. So yeah, I on December 1st, I left Tucson, which is where I was living. I had only been living there for about 8 months, but where I was at the time. And I have now gone about 12,000 miles, I guess, coincidentally, including to your house just several days ago. So
Just a few days ago, in fact.
yeah, we're doing this now from very far apart, but we were actually in the same room quite recently. But yeah, I went to the East Coast. That's where my children live, and that was another big thing that motivated me to get into the van, was to be able to spend more time with them than to be trapped in Tucson.
Mm.
And so I went to the East Coast, kind of down the East Coast as far as Key West, which I'd always wanted to see. And then it looked like maybe the van was going to die. So I drove back to Tucson, because if I was going to be stuck, I'd rather be stuck someplace warm, and I have some family there. The van did not die, so I drove up the East Coast along the Pacific Coast Highway as far as Portland. And now my younger son is about to turn 15, so right now I'm on my way to Tucson to pick up some medication and then driving back east. And with the first couple months of this, the first few months, I guess it's been 3 months almost, have really just been about figuring it out and figuring out whether I could do it, whether I liked to do it. What is it sustainable for me based on the amount of money I have coming in? But my vision for Vanarchism, and and part of why I named it what I named it, is that I would like to turn it into, kind of a rolling showcase for people who are doing interesting things all over the country, which is kind of what I've done with my podcasts in the past and my radio shows. I really haven't had the bandwidth personally yet to to do that, because it's been such an amazing shift and there's been so much to deal with.
But part of the idea is I mean, it's basically it's a multifaceted project that you're engaging in, which is I mean, part of why it's so interesting. I mean, it's partly I mean, as you write about and as you've talked about in other things so that you got up there, it's partly a project of of sort of self-discovery, as well as a project of the kind of like independent media work that you can do as a traveling grassroots on the ground sort of person with their ear to what's really happening on the ground where you're actually going, like as in terms of real sort of journalism, except not the jet set but the van set.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And podcasting is the main way I make my living. As a matter of fact, today is the 14-year anniversary of my show, The Jazz Session, which is a podcast where since February 24th, 2007, I've been interviewing jazz musicians. I spent a lot of my life working in the jazz world, both as a performer and then as a radio host and a podcaster. And so as I travel around, much the way we're doing now, except just in audio, I am recording interviews in the van and sometimes in person. And I've wanted, I had also another podcast that was called A Brief Chat, which is the last thing of mine that you were on, which was kind of a daily show that was talking about how to live authentic lives outside of this, the system. You put in your capital letters wherever you want to. And the living in a van, in many ways, kind of encapsulates a lot of the things that I believe in. I identify as an anarchist. That's a term that is it's become almost meaningless, but I kind of prefer to not participate in capitalism to whatever degree it is possible. I'm a poet and a podcaster, and both of those things are not particularly lucrative careers to follow. I mean, obviously I'm talking to an acoustic guitarist and protest singer, so talk about, there's never a choir that's been more ready to be preached to in this particular moment. But I've wanted to kind of, for lack of a better word, drop out of the kind of mainstream, like I have to work so I can pay somebody, a landlord, to live in their place so that I can sleep indoors and continue working so I can pay the landlord to live in there. And I've just wanted a way out of that. And it never occurred to me that one of the ways out of that was just not to pay a landlord anymore, was, to absent yourself from that piece frees you up from so many other pieces at the same time. And so that's kind of what I've embarked on. And then I'll draw this to a close, but the personal discovery piece, in addition to that, I'm a Buddhist, and that's been very important to me for decades. And so in some ways, this is almost like a weird monastic adventure in a van too, where, I have a lot of time on my own to meditate, and to kind of be in quiet and awe-inspiring spaces. And so yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna, it's not all beautiful, that's for sure. I'm literally sitting right above a bucket that I poop in, so it ain't all glorious, but I'm really glad I'm doing it. It's early days yet, but it feels very exciting, even when it's terrifying and lonely. And I think it's worth continuing to experiment with.
It's really an interesting project, and yeah, as you say, like, I mean, there are such pros and cons to the whole experience of living in a van and living in an old van, which is an interesting aspect to the whole thing. Because I mean, if you were just doing this as a project and you were, loaded with money, obviously you could get a new van and have a really completely different experience. And that's just, as someone who has put on in many different years upwards of 40,000 miles a year on a vehicle, I which actually by the standards of truckers is not much at all. I mean, the average trucker puts 150,000, 200,000 a year, in miles a year, which is, to me, just sounds like absolutely miserable. But 40,000 miles is I think amazing way to see the country as you're touring around, but then again, when you're touring, you kind of on a concert tour, like I tend to, you always have you tend to have a predetermined destinations.
Sure.
But at the same time, like when I was always basically beholden to the landlord, and unable to travel without plans, then it also meant it was very difficult or impossible to get to stuff that was happening kind of on a last minute basis. But in your situation, without the landlord living in the van, potentially you could get to stuff that's happening when it's happening. But then again, at the same time, this is an ancient vehicle, and you never know when it's going to last. Which I wonder, is that part of the Buddhist practice? I mean, obviously, probably if you had more money, you'd have a newer vehicle. But it's also it might be an interesting aspect of the life is suffering kind of thing, because you know you are guaranteed in that vehicle. You're absolutely guaranteed that you're not going to be making it to wherever you want to go half the time.
Yeah, I mean, right before I saw you, I was broken down for 5 days in a small town in southeastern Oregon, right on the coast, a town called Port Orford. I actually broke down in the mountains with no cell phone signal, was able to coast down a mountain to a place where I got a cell phone signal just long enough to get in to AAA. The tow truck driver called me. He said, "I don't even know how you have a signal where you are right now." And he came and he towed me. I was on Lenny, which is, my van is named Lenny after Lenny Bruce, who's one of my very few heroes. And because of COVID, you can't sit in the cab with the tow truck driver anymore. And he had one of those flatbed tow trucks. So he put Lenny up on the flatbed. And then we drove through these windy mountain roads with me in the van, which is like doing this thing. And I'm just seat belted in. And from that vantage point, you can see over the edge of the cliff. Like when you're in your regular vehicle, you can't, at the regular height, you can't. But now I'm like 10 or 11 feet in the air, and we're just going around these turns. And, because of the suspension on the tow truck, Lenny's just like leaning over. And I'm like looking down into the abyss in this foggy Oregon morning as we're going around these turns. And then he drops me off at a garage. It's like Friday afternoon. The garage doesn't open again until Monday. And he said, I called the guy, and you can stay here. This tow truck driver was amazing. I don't know if he's lived in a vehicle or what, but he had everything figured out. He said, I called the guy. You can stay here in front of the garage until he reopens on Monday. And there's a grocery store a block from here. Well, a block. There's no blocks in this town. There's no lights, no anything. But he said, right over there through the trees is a grocery store, so you'll be able to get food. He said, do you have a way to heat your van without the engine? I said, yes, I can heat. I said, all right, then sounds like you'll be all set. And off he went into the night. And yeah, so there's definitely a certain amount of uncertainty in this whole thing. I mean, Lenny was really well cared for. So even though he's 21 years old, he's done extremely well. He's only really kind of catastrophically failed this one time, and it was actually a fairly inexpensive fix. But
in the mountains of southern Oregon, was it?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I broke down there in the van before.
It's a great place to break down. I mean,
they're really big.
They are. A guy in a pickup truck pulled up, and it was pouring rain, and I had no signal. He pulled up across the road, and he walked over, and he said, I had my flashers on, and I was pulled over in a place that clearly was not okay to pull over. And he said, are you okay? I said, well, actually, my vehicle's not working. And he said, well, I can give you a ride to the next town, but you'll have to sit in the bed of the truck because there's another person in the cab with me. And it's just like bucketing down rain. It's like, I don't know, 37 degrees or something. And I said, that's incredibly kind of you. I think I'm going to try my luck coasting down this mountain and see if I can find a signal. But thank you so much. I had no idea how far the next town was. And the idea of like sitting in this guy's truck in the rain for however long and leaving all of my stuff on the side of the mountain, it didn't seem like the thing to do. And as it turned out, I made the right choice, which is rare for me in travel situations, but I was able to coast to a weather anomaly and get a little bit of a cell phone. And yeah, I do. I mean, the thing is, I don't have any money. So the very first thing, there's an enormous class system in van dwelling and RV dwelling, right? From the people who have, the $60,000 vans and are like, the Instagram models, and the people in fifth wheel RVs and that, and then down to me. Like where if I wasn't living in this van, I'd be living on the street. That's my other option. So I
Well,
don't have any.
I have to interject that there's
Yes.
also living in Portland. I have to interject. There's also a huge swathe of what is it? Uh, you know, a, a class, I guess, of people who live in
Yeah.
broken down vehicles. That's
Oh,
another
sure. That
element,
never move
Yeah.
anywhere. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
vehicles that don't move, but they're not living on actually on the street or in tents, and of course, whether their vehicle lasts very long before it gets towed away after it gets
Yeah.
ticketed. I mean, that's another question. But yeah, there's this whole phenomenon of vehicles that clearly have not run in a long time in this
Yeah. Our
city that
next
people are
interview
living
may
in.
very well be from the impound yard where I'm living in Lennon, hoping they don't realize that I come out at night to empty the pee bottle in the impound yard. That kind of thing. So we'll see.
That's worse than living in a storage unit.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But the only thing about having no money is that if you look into van life, even at the low end, the thing that they'll tell you, the people who make van life videos above anything else is have some kind of emergency fund because you're going to break down. And because I never lived that way, I don't have any kind of emergency fund. And it looks like, maybe Uncle Joe is never going to send us any more money. I thought maybe that $2,000 I would just have as in the savings for the emergency fund, but who knows? So I'm not sure that there will be an emergency fund anytime soon because I basically make enough money to keep myself alive, but not anymore. And so there is always that little frisson of danger that comes with doing this, because if something really bad does happen that costs $500, $1,000, $2,000 to fix, that's not an option for me. I mean, I would just have to get to some place where I could just park.
Yeah, and that is inevitably going to happen, and any
Exactly, yeah.
week now. Yeah,
Yeah, that's exactly.
In that van.
Thank you. You're making me feel a lot better. I'm so glad we did this interview. This is great.
but so it's like I think it's like 40% of the country is in a position where if they had a sudden expense of $400 or
Yes.
more, that they would be unable to deal with that expense with their current resources without having to
Yeah.
like sell some belonging or
Right.
something drastic, right? And you're, I mean, I guess it's not exactly accurate to say that you're necessarily in that position, because you could, if you lived on rice and beans for a few weeks, you might make enough money on Patreon to get your van fixed. I don't want to be too exposing your finances here, but I think that's fairly public information, actually.
And I don't need both these kidneys, really, when you come right down to it. So, I mean, I could get
We
the
got
van
two
fixed
of them.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I always say about things we got two of,
That's exactly
That's why we
right.
got two of them.
Yeah, I feel like kind of a hoarder with both these functioning.
Right?
So, yeah. It's a little bourgeois.
So there's people that make van life videos. I mean, there's a lot going on in the internet I didn't know about, like unboxing videos. I didn't even realize that was a thing until like somebody, so what's van life videos? And then that must be, I mean, it must be fascinating because as you say, there's so many different ways to be living in a van. So many different, I mean, there's such a broad class, or I mean, it'd be hard to really even encapsulate in a few paragraphs the number of different lifestyles that people might be having living in vans. I mean, it could from everything from like the very top to the bottom, right? Almost.
Yeah, and the spectrum of van life videos is not as broad as the spectrum of people who live in vehicles. But I mean, van life is enormous now. I mean, there are people who, first of all, if you drive anywhere through the Southwest or up the Pacific Coast Highway, you will see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of vans, whether they're people who live full time in them, whether they've rented them for an excursion, old RVs, expensive RVs, the whole deal. As you drive up the coast or through the Southwest, which are popular places to do that kind of thing because it's warm.
You include RV in this? Like van life includes RV dwellers, but it does not include people living in their Toyota Corolla?
Oh, no, I would include that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I would include anybody who basically vehicle dwellers. And so, the spectrum of vehicle dwellers is enormous because, I mean, an RV can mean, I have a 1972, Toyota RV that has 400,000 miles on it, and that's one kind of RV life. And then it can be I have a $70,000 pickup truck that hauls a $300,000 RV on the back that has like the kitchen extensions that come out. That's a whole other kind of life, and those class distinctions exist in the van life world too. But once I started living in a van, I realized that tons and tons of people who don't live in vans and have no desire to ever live in a van watch van life videos. And I would say the kind of sweet spot of popularity for van life videos is, generally speaking, attractive people in 30 to $60,000 van in kind of getaway destinations, having adventures and looking great on camera. And then there is a kind of gang of people who are like much less well off, who also make van life videos, and those are the people from whom I primarily learned. There's a kind of a whole community of those folks who are kind of doing what I'm doing in one way or another. But it's enormous. In fact, just last week, a movie came out, like an actual Hollywood film with Frances McDormand from Fargo in it, called Nomad Land, in which she portrays someone who has to move into a vehicle.
Have you
I
seen
haven't
it?
seen it yet. I
Yeah,
haven't seen
I'm
it yet.
very
No.
curious to see it.
Yeah, I'm curious to see it too. And in fact, I didn't watch it immediately when it came out, as so many people did, because I was a little worried about, like, I didn't really want to watch something that kind of was more along the lines of glorifying van life. But I talked to a couple friends of mine who are van dwellers who said, no, it's pretty legit. It is a look at the at the less well off end of van life, and does a pretty good job of it. So I definitely will give it a look. But it's like kind of like anything else. Like if I don't know, the example I always think of is if you buy a particular kind of car, you suddenly see that kind of car everywhere when you never noticed it before. It's kind of the same thing. Once I moved into a vehicle, I suddenly see people in vehicles, living in vehicles everywhere where I never noticed it before. And I see people who are incredibly interested in this lifestyle, not because they ever want to live it. They've just learned about it, and they're fascinated by it. I mean, the biggest van life YouTubers have millions of followers, and
Wow.
it's a big deal. Yeah. So I mean, I
And are
myself
they
was
doing
very
these, like, are they doing daily updates, and are they traveling with any kind of a particular project in mind or a purpose in mind, or are they just living in their vans? And I mean, I guess it must vary a lot. Some people are traveling in for fun, and other people are traveling because that's where the work is. I mean, I've heard that there's a whole very large number of largely retired people who are basically migratory workers, but they're not working in in farms. They're working in different sort of seasonal jobs that are generally like desk type jobs that they can do from there while living in their RVs and parked in the Walmart parking lot. And I think there was a documentary done about this whole group of people who are oftentimes doing this partly because they can't easily afford to actually live in a, like, if they wanted to retire to Florida, like a lot of them might
right.
like to, they can't afford to do that, but they can afford to live in an RV, which seems very expensive, but apparently it's less expensive than retiring to Florida. I don't know. I've never tried to do either, so I don't know what all the expenses are involved.
Yeah, an RV is definitely a much more expensive way to go. I mean, even if you have a small RV, it's much, much more expensive than a van, even a larger van. I mean, a huge part of that is gas mileage. Another part is that the upkeep of those things were, generally speaking, all the parts are much more expensive. But yeah, there's definitely a whole class of nomads who'd follow seasonal work. And that can be everything from, I mean, there's a lot of people, for example, who work the beet harvests in the upper Midwest, which happen either once or twice a year. I can't remember. And, people will kind of descend. And it's like the beet harvest is in many ways built around that fact that there are people who will just drive there in their vehicles. They have a whole like list of here's what your vehicle has to have for us to allow you to live here. Like you have to be able to heat it, and various things like that. And then a lot of people who will do, I'm not actually sure what they did in 2020, but I know for a fact there are a lot of people who will, for example, work in resorts or amusement parks during their busy seasons, that kind of thing. So in fact, a family member of mine used to do that, going from like Disney World in Florida up to some national parks, in the West in the summertime, Disney World in the wintertime. And they would just kind of go back and forth between those jobs, like being a campground host and then being a, ticket taker or whatever, it might be on the other end. There's a lot of digital nomads. So people who have jobs, which is what I am, I guess, technically, people who have jobs they can do exclusively online. And that can range from, like, I'm the creative director of a company and I make $100,000 a year. And so I'd rather do that since I don't have to go to an office. Why wouldn't I do that, looking at the Rocky Mountains one week and looking at the Pacific the next week? So there's that. And then, there's people who maybe teach online classes. There, people like, I guess there's a smaller number of podcasters, but, people who do other kinds of digital creative work, or even just kind of digital drudgery. I mean, there's lots of just online jobs that need to be done. I mean, kind of editing farms or things like that, where people are just kind of churning stuff out, writing copy or data entry. There's lots of those things you can just kind of hire yourself on as a temp, to do when that work is available. So yeah, there's lots of ways to make a living, and it's
or to
not
survive anyway. Like, I guess there'd be also a lot of
Yes.
people who could do all sorts of digital work. Like when you mentioned the copy, I wonder how much this plays into it, because I know a lot of people who used to make good, or at least pretty good livings as journalists, who now, and I'm sure this is something you're very familiar with, that now if they want to attempt to make a living as journalists, they still might have options, like, for example, writing for these, what do they call them, like, basically farms that put out copy, right? But then you're writing per word, and you have to put out a certain number of words, and then you basically end up becoming a speed addict, and then you make like $150 a week, and if you publish a lot, so then maybe you could survive on that, living in a vehicle without traveling much, but you sure can't pay rent on that kind of thing. And it's sort of like similar to, I guess, a musician trying to live off of their Spotify royalties. Maybe they could do that in a van.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe.
Yeah. And, for me, a big part of the calculus of a van, I mean, because, on the money that I make in a month, I could definitely rent a room somewhere, and if I moved into a rural enough place, I could maybe even rent an entire apartment for what I make in a month. So it's not like it would be impossible for me to live in a stationary place with a roof over my head if I wanted to. And I mean, I am lucky enough that probably if I really put the arm on somebody, like my sister or one or two of my closest friends, I'd have a place that I could live if I needed it. But there is a calculation between creature comforts and freedom that a lot of people who choose to do this kind of thing make, and is in fact the calculation that I made, which is to the degree that you're willing to give up kind of creature comforts, and that what's on that list varies for people, but to the degree that you're willing to give those things up, what you get in return for that is some amount of freedom, and that can be freedom from a certain amount of work that you would have to otherwise do. It could be the freedom of motion, to travel where you want to. It could be the freedom to, kind of not be contacted by people, or to, to not have to engage in society for the most part if you don't want to. And so that to me is that's the key equation in van life, particularly at this level, where I live in, I mean, my van is 32 square feet inside. The part that I actually live in is probably about, I don't know, 20 square feet or something, because part of it is the cab and everything. So but the bit that I actually live in is just the back here. And and for that, and like I said, I mean, I use bathrooms in places where that's possible, but I also have gone to the bathroom in a bucket, and I have a bottle to pee in that's right here next to me. And for that, like, to do that, and to have to sponge bathe most of the time, because even though I do have this membership to a gym chain, I'm very often in places where there's not a gym. But what I get in return is, like, for the last 3 days, I was driving through, like, along the Rocky Mountains, kind of through Eastern Oregon and Nevada, in some of the most gorgeous places I have ever seen. And when the first of the month rolls around, I don't send a check to a wealthy industrialist or investor from, wherever, who controls whether I can sleep inside or not. And, that trade right now is worth it for me. For the things that I get, I am willing to give up, what I have given up. And everybody's list of comforts is different. Everybody's willingness, everybody's desire for freedom is different. I mean, not everybody feels that way, and I totally understand that. But for me, I mean, I did that math, and I don't find, if I found living in the van a hardship, I'd find some other way to do it. Like it's exciting. I don't just spend all day every day inside 20 square feet. I mean, the whole world is out there. So
Yeah,
I
this
go
is
places where it's
your
exciting to walk.
shell. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
exactly.
do you find that living in the van so far that basically would you say it's accurate that the highs are higher and the lows are lower generally?
Yes. Yes. That is definitely true. I mean, I struggle a lot with loneliness even in my regular life, and during the pandemic that was definitely true. I mean, during almost all of the pandemic I lived with my partner. But we moved to a place where we knew a few people who are in my family, but we had no friends and we had no social circle. And even if we had one, that there was no way to participate in it, obviously during all the lockdown and everything. And so I definitely struggled a lot, with loneliness in that time. And in some ways, van life has made things better. I mean, for example, I've traveled east to see my kids, and I saw my sister, and I saw you. I mean, I haven't. I really. It's not like I've kind of been going around the country visiting people because that seems irresponsible. But I mean, I have visited some people because I don't know. I don't have an excuse for it. It's just what I wanted to do, and most of the time I'm alone, and I feel like I'm safe enough that if I take precautions when I see people, it's okay. But so some of the times when I am lonely, especially because I moved into a van right after what I thought was going to be a very extended partnership with this person ended. So I've kind of had to figure all of that out, process all these emotions and everything, alone in a van. And there are definitely times when you're sleeping in a 99 Dodge Caravan when 3 months ago you were sleeping in a bed with a person you loved very much, and you think to yourself, like, what the hell is going on? I mean, is my life bottoming out right now? Like, I'm a father of two, my kid's dad lives in a van. There are definitely times when you look at it that way and you think, like, you know I was gonna say there's no lower to go, but I've actually been lower than this. But in any case, where it seems very grim. But then there are also times when you wake up on the that when you've parked overnight on the edge of a cliff and you wake up and the Pacific is just stretching away into infinity, and there are these gorgeous cliffs all around you, and there are birds that I haven't seen before in the trees, and I'm writing a poem or working on a piece of music or recording an interview with somebody, and I think, like, I wouldn't trade this for anything. So I mean, you are right that the peaks and valleys are much farther apart. Even though I tend emotionally to have been a person who had peaks and valleys in the past, I would say now that they're much farther apart. And admittedly, I'm only 3 months in, excuse me, but I do notice that the valleys are lessening somewhat. I think part of that is I'm processing the emotion of the breakup, and certainly, part of it is I'm getting more used to this life. But I find myself in that kind of really dark space less often as the weeks go on, and the kind of space of gratefulness and adventure is starting to predominate, which to the degree that that remains true, I think it's a sign that this is an okay thing to be doing. And if I get to a place where I can no longer find the joy in doing this and it becomes mostly valley, that's when I'll have to kind of rethink my lifestyle.
Then again, with all the different complex array of factors involved with re recovering from the breakup during it's a pandemic going on, and it's winter, and there's so many other factors that could
Yeah.
influence your emotions one way or another. What do your kids think of what you're doing?
It's interesting. So I have two sons. One is 18, he's a freshman in college, and the other is 14, although he'll be 15 in a couple weeks, and he's a freshman in high school. And my 18-year-old I think for a lot, when he got old enough to kind of look at me as an example, obviously for the first big chunk of his life, we lived together. But when I no longer lived in the same house as him, I think he looked at my example as kind of a cautionary tale. Like he would often talk when he was of an age to start talking about what he wanted to do with his life. It was often less specific, like, jobs or interest areas, and more, I want to be financially secure. Which, in one sense is a terrible thing for a child to have to think about. And I feel awful about that. But in another sense is, like, I get why he feels that way when he looks at me. But he's recently taken a hard left shift. I mean, I can't really claim too much credit for it. Obviously, he grew up with me as a dad and he saw all the stuff I was into. But most of this he's done on his own since getting to college. And he now talks about me like being in the vanguard, so that when everything collapses, as it's inevitably going to do, I already have a place to live.
And the vanguard.
Right. I'm not dependent. Right. Yeah. There's a beautiful pun.
That's what I say too. You're the vanguard of anarchism.
The vanguard of anarchism. Which is awesome. And then my other son is a BMX rider and is totally into like this, kind of BMX infused like punk counterculture. And I think he's always looked at a lot of the weird stuff I do and the unconventional ways in which I've lived as just how I do it. He's 4 years younger than his brother, so more of his life I've been doing these kind of things. And he does not have the same, or does not have the same vision of the future that his brother had. And so I think he's much more interested. Like, he wants to go. In fact, he said to me the other day, I think I'd like to live in a van at some point too, coming up, when I get out of high school. And, he looks at me traveling to these places, and I send him pictures he's really into cars too. And I send him pictures of cool cars that I see. And, he looks at that, me driving, up the California coast and thinks like, that looks amazing. Like, I would totally like to do that. So
good.
It is good. And I struggle a lot because I'm not a great provider for my kids in financial terms. I mean, I do support them financially, but of course I'd love to do a lot more. And really the only time I ever made any decent money was when I was a union organizer. And, most of my life when, they've been alive, I really haven't made very much money. And so there's a lot of the things that it doesn't matter how much of an anti-capitalist I am. There's also parenthood. And I grew up in the United States, in the 1970s and 80s. And there was that meant a certain thing, for what you were supposed to do as a parent for your kids, and how, the next generation was supposed to be better off than you were, which, my kids are not, definitely. And I have a lot of, on my bad days, I have a lot of guilt about that. On my good days, I think, like, my kids live in State College, Pennsylvania, which is it thinks it's a liberal town, but it's a very conservative town, ruled by this enormous, multi-billion-dollar institution of Penn State. And, it's a kind of, in a lot of ways, it's kind of an awful place. And my kids, they see a lot of examples of kind of ostentatious wealth and of a real need to toe the line, whether it's to maintain your employment at Penn State, or whether it's because every single person in town feels the same way about the football team and the 108,000 seat stadium there. They see a lot of those examples. And so on my good days as a father, I think there's nothing more valuable I can give my kids than the fact that their dad is some kind of like itinerant poet and podcaster who just doesn't buy into any of that stuff. And whatever they do with themselves going forward, it makes me feel good to know that somewhere in the back of their mind, they've at least been shown there is some other option. It's not a perfect option, and it doesn't come with all the bells and whistles of the more standard ways to live, but there are other places you can go in your life besides the way you're going to be funneled into by the chute of, education. And that feels good when I can think about it that way.
You ever play music while you're on the road? You play saxophone, don't you? Is that a past tense thing, or is that something you're doing much of these days?
No, I do play music. I'm sitting in front of a diddley bow that was made by my friend Angus in Australia, that he sent to me, and I have a right out of the shot, but this thing here is a cajon. For when I was a professional musician, I played saxophone and percussion, and then I did that many, many years ago, and then more recently, like in the last 6 or 7 years, I was doing it again, although part-time. I used to do it as my actual living. And yeah, saxophone was my main instrument. In more recent years, I've mostly played with singer-songwriters, and so I played a lot of percussion and then like saxophone solos in the songs and that kind of thing. Um, my A part of my whole thing about moving to Tucson, which is where I started my professional music career 25 years ago, was that I was hoping that I would get to play a lot again, because that had in state college that I played sometimes, but it wasn't great. And of course, I got to Tucson just in time for there to be no gigs at all. So on the road, the main thing I've been doing, because like I guess busking would be an option, although mostly the things that I play and the way I play, I'm not really it's not great to listen to on the street corner. And so one thing I have been doing is creating these poem songs in the van, where I create music tracks using the same setup that I use for podcasting, and then do a piece of my poetry over the top of it. And actually, I very excitingly, just in fact, I think it was maybe the day before I saw you, I found out that one of those that I had submitted to Hello America Stereo Cassettes, which is a new label that just started, run by Adam Gennady, who's a really wonderful writer and promoter of artistic things. One of those tracks got accepted by the label and is going to be on an upcoming mixtape. So that kind of inspires me to do even more of that. And I kind of dig the fact that it's like all happening inside of this Dodge Caravan. I mean, this
and I
van
love that poem, that piece about
Thank you.
the Buddha and all these quote all these things the Buddha did not
Yes.
say. But have you never thought about just I mean, coming from a person who used to also make a living playing street music specifically,
Yeah.
like, did you ever think about just playing a few popular jazz standards on the sax and making probably quite a bit of money busking in front of some shopping center or something? I mean, maybe during the pandemic in the winter it might not be ideal and your lips might freeze, but it could be when you have a big breakdown, and hopefully it happens somewhere near a city or a college town.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it might change from busking to my career path. We'll see we'll see how that goes. And I have done some busking in the past. The thing is, like, I play saxophone, but I mostly did not play jazz. I mostly played other styles of music, like R&B and funk and kind of singer-songwritery music, where my role is as a soloist. And that's very different than like standing on the street corner playing standards. And then I play cajon, but I don't really like play cajon to accompany myself while I sing. I think my best bet would be if, as my diddley bow chops get better, I have gotten to the point where I can accompany myself and sing in a kind of rudimentary way. So there might be a place where I can do that, and perhaps I'll figure out some way to do all of this. The only thing about the saxophone that makes me nervous is during the pandemic, being in a public place and playing an instrument that you cannot wear a mask while you play, and it involves constantly breathing in deeply, has seemed a little more risky than it needed to be. Yeah. So, but I'm definitely keeping that out there as an option. That's for sure.
So Paula comments that for some reason we're only getting comments on YouTube and not on Twitter and Facebook, okay. But I can see them anyway. If anybody has a comment out there, and I would have mentioned them, except that there's not really many questions coming in particular. But you turned poemed into a verb, Paula, and I need you to explain that.
Whenever I post a new poem, I always post it with the caption "I poemed." Which, and I don't know if I can even take credit for that. It's either I started doing that years ago, or my friend Carolee Bennett, who's a really wonderful poet, started doing it years ago, and I copied her. I think we have both done it, and I can't remember which order it is because it's been so long now. But yeah, that's just always the caption. Part of that is to get around explaining the poem. It's when you post stuff on Instagram, and I used to have a personal Twitter account. I just have one for my my jazz show now, but you know, when I would post in those places, generally speaking, it's good to have some little piece of accompanying text, but I never really wanted the text to be about the poem. I just want the people to read the poem and take from it whatever they want. They don't have to take from it what I want. So I poemed is kind of a cute, you know, a cute way to have there be some accompanying meaningless text. And, you know, it's mildly memorable to people who, you know, follow me closely. Like I know that, you know, Paula does these days. So.
But is it like that when you write a poem, like this feeling like when the poem is coming on and you're writing a poem? Is it this feeling like there's a poem coming on, kind of like a sneeze is coming on or something? You know, is it that kind
Yeah,
of
for
feeling?
me, I know it's not that way for a lot of poets. A lot of poets are, you know, like daily sit down with a piece of paper, you know, churn something out, edit it. I've never really been that kind of person. I tend to be an inspirational poet. I don't meaning one who works when the inspiration presents itself. Not that I'm inspirational to others. I think I'm more
Hopefully that too.
cautionary. Yeah, I'm a cautionary poet in that sense. But yeah, so I tend to be when the poem comes, it tends to come fully formed or maybe you know, as a block that mostly has the shape of the thing it's going to be, and I chisel a few little bits off here and there. But yeah, for the most part, I write fairly quickly, and I also my poems. I say the thing about not wanting to tell people what to think of the poem, but 99% of the time, it's very obvious what the poem is about. I'm not a poet of the avant-garde or you know, a poet who uses a ton of interesting metaphors. I tend to be kind of a plain language poet. I often joke that, you know, the older and older I've gotten, I'm 47 now, the older I've gotten, the smaller my vocabulary has gotten, and that by the time I'm like 70 years old, all my poems will just be the same single word over and over again. And that's kind of how I feel. I feel like I'm just distilling all of the poetry I've read, like taking out all the stuff that makes it like, who knows, interesting maybe. I don't know. But I'm distilling it down into just saying exactly what I mean most of the time. And it's
Which is
incredibly
kind of
useful to
what
me.
poetry can be amazingly good at, right? I mean, the form of
Yeah.
poetry, it's such a tight, short, strict kind of form compared to other forms of writing where you better say it all really well and really succinctly, or else you just don't bother, right?
Well, a lot of poets would vehemently disagree with that characterization of poetry,
Yeah, like James
but
Joyce.
yes, but I don't. That does tend to be how I write, kind of short and sweet. I really love the haiku form, but I do write the majority of my stuff is longer than haiku. But you know, for example, when we were talking about the breakup, I mean, of I do have friends and a support network. I don't want to give the impression that I never talk to anybody about this stuff and that I'm just doing it all in my own head. I do try to, you know, behave in healthy ways and talk to people about what's going on in my life. But a lot of the time I am alone, and it's not always a convenient time to call someone, and it's not always useful to call someone. Like, you know, oftentimes when you talk to people about really difficult things, what you mostly need them to do is just listen to you. And sometimes people want to process more with you than you want to process with them.
Mm,
And so poetry for me, you know, in recent months has been a really useful way to look at this breakup and discover the other feelings. Because when it happened, we put this really uh, great face on it, you know, this really brave face on what was happening.
mm.
Um, and a lot of that wasn't really true to what I was actually feeling. And so, you know, through the medium of writing about it, I have brought out for my own use a lot of the other emotions that were, you know, were kind of jammed in there that and I'm not like an American male who doesn't deal with his emotions. My heart is on my sleeve 24 hours a day, but it doesn't always mean I recognize everything that's going on inside me. I mean,
Mm.
like anyone, you know, you can be a mystery to yourself. So the medium of poetry has really helped me process. And you know, I've noticed as I've started to put poems on my Vanarchism account, because I used to have a personal Instagram, a personal Twitter, and I've kind of reduced all that stuff to, you know, I have stuff for my jazz show and I have a thing for the Van account. And I've started to put more of my personal life that isn't about the van onto the Van account. And actually, the more I do that, the more people start responding. The more poems I write about the end of my relationship and dealing with heartbreak and, you know, with anger and with the fear of being alone and things like that. That kind of stuff, like, it's cool to post beautiful pictures of the Rocky Mountains, but everybody does that, you know. And so the more
But
I
the
kind
whole
of
three-dimensional, you're putting yourself out there in three dimensions
exactly,
with this whole thing, and it's like almost like I mean, in a very positive way, it reminds me a bit of the Truman Show, or like it just this kind of,
yeah,
you know, we're really just there with you, and you're talking about your relationship, and you're talking about what you're going to do that day, and you're talking about history, and it's just it's a wonderful kind of I mean it's the sort of thing that makes the internet look really good to me in terms
oh,
of
thank
like
you.
what the potential that the internet has to, like, we can go travel around the country with somebody in their old van and you know, feel like we're there in many ways, which it's
It's ironic for
particular.
you to say that because so many of us in the world have done exactly that with you for years. I mean, you know, I've been a fan of your music for decades, and you know, as you have kind of had varying kinds of digital presences. I mean, because I've only ever seen you play in person one time, but I have seen you play. I mean, I don't even know how many times at this point, and I've heard recordings of concerts and you know, read your journals and your book. You know, that kind of collected your blog posts, and you know, so you know, for many years, for most of the last 20 plus years since I first learned that you existed, I've been living in a series of static places, you know, with a wife and two kids, or, you know, on my own or with a partner, and been following you as you kind of travel around the world. It's an interesting role reversal for me, to be the person who's moving instead of the person who's just talking to the people who are moving and doing things. But
Hmm.
it is not at all a role reversal for me to, or uncommon for me to just be exactly who I am online, kind of, you know, both with the flaws and the gems of, you know, of my life. I mean, you know, like everybody, I mean, I've made really huge mistakes and a lot of small mistakes, and I've also done some really cool things that I'm proud of, and some of them intentionally and some of them accidentally. And through my whole career as a radio person, as a podcaster, as a poet, all of the things that I've done, I I think the one thing that I tend to do that causes people to be interested sometimes in what I do is that I just say exactly what it is that I'm doing and feeling. Because that's what interests me about other people. When people expose who they really are, I mean, that's what we latch onto as human beings.
Mm.
Um, you know, posed photos in front of gorgeous locales are cool, and I've done some of those as well, because sometimes they feel good. But life is about a lot more than that, and you know, I'm interested in people who are grappling with all of it. And you know, sometimes it doesn't need to be grappled with; sometimes it just can be enjoyed, and that's cool too. But I want to see the whole picture. That's what I'm interested in.
If I were traveling around without a plan in terms of gigs and stuff like that, I would. My tendency, I think, and I've never done it, but my tendency would be to go very slowly and spend at least like a few days in one place and then a few days somewhere else, and kind of it would take a year to get down the coast, I think. But
Right.
but you're not doing it like that at this point. Are you thinking about how you're going to do the van project into the future? I imagine it's not going to involve quite so many like drives from Tucson to Pennsylvania in 3 days or whatever you're doing right now.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. My first 3 months of van life have kind of been like a master class in how not to live van life. I mean, I you know, in 3 months I've driven like 12,000 miles, and that's way too much. You know, I can't do the math, but I think at that place that puts it into your touring musician
Yeah.
levels, you know, in a year. And um the two things about that. One, when I started, my immediate goal was to go see my children and my sister who live 2,500 miles from where I started. And so you know, I kind of just did that. And then I was on the East Coast, and I wanted to be warm because it really sucks to be in super cold in the van. And so I wanted to be warm, and I just kept going south, and it kept being freezing at night, and I just kept going south until I eventually ended up in Key West. But then, no offense to the cool Floridians, but I hated Florida. So I drove back up out of Florida, kind of like I was being chased by demons. But then when I got back into Georgia, it seemed like the van was about to die. The transmission was going to die. So then I drove in 3 more days all the way back from Georgia to Arizona. And then I started what to me was kind of a leisurely trip up the coast. Like, it took me a month to go from San Diego to Portland. And that to me is very, is slow.
Yeah.
It's certainly slow compared to what I was doing.
Oh, that's very nice.
But then, my kid's birthday is coming up, and I'd like to be there for that. And that's, Portland to Pennsylvania is very far, and my healthcare is based in Arizona. I have Medicaid based in Arizona, and it only works in Arizona. So in order to get medication or to see a doctor or anything, and I take medications, I have to go to Arizona. So, I have to drive to Tucson because I need these medications, and they'll run out before I could get back from Pennsylvania. And I have to go to Pennsylvania by his birthday. So yeah, all of a sudden I'm doing these long hauls. The only other thing I will say about that is that I used to say about myself that I get tired pulling out of my own driveway. Like, I was not a long haul driver, except in my 20s. But for most of my life, whoever I was with I would let them do the driving as much as possible. I always get sleepy. As soon as I started van life, now I really, really love being on the road. I do tend to avoid highways whenever possible. I tend to take smaller, state routes or local roads or whatever. But I love the driving part of it. Like, I really love the scenery. And so I've noticed about myself that I really have to fight to sit still. Like, the breakdown was kind of a gift because I stayed in one place for 4 days or 5 days. It's not exactly the place I would have picked, but it was still lovely just to spend a bunch of time in a place I'd never been with nothing to do and no option of doing anything, even had I wanted to. So, that was kind of nice. And then, I spent a few days in beautiful parts of the coast that I really wanted to see, and I had no particular need to be anywhere. I'm not sure after my son's birthday. My other son's birthday is in November. So there's a long time between the two of them, and I have no real schedule or any place I have to be other than to do a little medical stuff at some point in the Southwest. So I'm really hoping, this is probably a lie, but I'm really hoping that I will slow down even more after I get to Pennsylvania. And I'd love to spend more time on the East Coast. I'm from Massachusetts, and I really love my home state. And, I would love to spend more time there. It's just been very, very cold there. So, maybe in the summer I can spend time kind of being in the Northeast for most of it, and, spending even more regular time with my kids and my sister, and, kind of staying in one general region. And the only inconvenient thing about that is that every time I renew my medication, I either have to have somebody mail them to me from Arizona, or I have to go to Arizona. Thank you for not having a national healthcare in our country.
Right.
It definitely, makes life a lot easier. So
at least there's a national gym membership.
That's right. We can't have healthcare, but we can definitely get coronavirus on a treadmill. And I think, if you're going to trade off, that's a good trade off.
Right? You can't have everything.
No, exactly. Sorry, I was being greedy there for a minute. I apologize. Let me bring myself back down there.
Yeah, what do you want? You're an American.
I'm happy to get the Rona on a Stairmaster. That's just as good as healthcare.
There you go.
I wish I had a way to make God Bless America start playing quietly behind me right now.
That would be the ideal thing. I need to work on the technical. Really.
Just a flag drops down.
Yeah.
I get a patent helmet.
Can you, before we go, Jason, can you show us what that instrument is you've been referring to? Is this something you can just grab and show us?
Yep.
Because all I see is the silhouette, and it looks very interesting.
The gracefulness of van life. So this is a diddly bow.
Great.
Basically, it kind of like almost like a cigar box guitar kind of in concept, except that no part of it is made from a cigar box. So a diddly bow has one string, and they come in various shapes and sizes. Sometimes they're a long piece of wood with like a can at one end that a string is put over so it tightens, and you whack it with a stick. In this case, you play it with a with my slide is, it would be even more awkward to grab that out right now, but I play it with a slide in either my thumb or a pick, and then, you know, kind of sounds like that, except that I can't make the notes just with my fingers. I have to have
Because you need a slide,
but,
right? I see.
yeah. And so, I mean, like almost every stringed instrument that looks like this, I mean, you know, they originated in Africa. I mean, you know, just like the banjo and the precursors of the guitar, and, you know, all those kind of kora, all those kind of things.
Kora, yeah.
Yeah. Which I know Koto is a.
I just took a picture of. She was holding the ukulele,
yeah.
just like a kora. I love kora. It's an amazing instrument. Yeah.
Oh, it really is. And so the diddley bow. There's a guy named Cooper Moore, a jazz musician named Cooper Moore, who's a piano player, but he's also a genius diddley bow player. He has an electric one that looks less like this and more like the kind of stick thing that I was describing, almost like a koto with only one string. If you've ever seen a Japanese koto out there in listener land.
Great.
The cool thing about this, like, basically I just make bass lines and accompany myself. But then when I do things multi-tracked, I will use this several times over. So I'll detune it digitally so that it does actually sound like a bass, and then there's no harmonic, you know, there's no chordal structure, but I'll play the, you know, maybe the outlines of a chord on it or something like that, and then I can also use it, you know, for a solo line or whatever. And, you know, using the wonders of digital effects, it can sound like a lot more than just this box. But there are a lot, if you just look up diddley bow on YouTube or wherever, there are a lot of really cool kind of one string players who make an amazing amount of music, you know, with one string and a slide. I am absolutely not at the amazing amount of music level. I'm at the rudimentary amount of music level, but it's super fun to play.
That's what the future is for. Yeah,
that's exactly right.
Room for improvement.
I'm going to get enlightened and learn to play the diddley bow. Those are my two. Those are my two goals. And
excellent plan. That's that's good. You might achieve all that. Yeah, you never know.
We'll see what happens.
Jason, have a good rest of the trip to Pennsylvania, and happy birthday
you so much
to your son. And
thank you.
Talk to you soon, I hope.
All right, I appreciate it, David. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being on.
Bye-bye.
See ya. And thanks everybody for tuning into this conversation with Jason Crane, the vanguard of Vanarchism. And go to vanarchism.com and read and listen to and view videos about what Jason is up to, and also support him on Patreon. That link on the bottom of the screen is to my Patreon account, but also Jason and Vanarchism is supported on Patreon as well. And thanks everybody for tuning in. And I will be back. I think I'm back on Friday, and I'll be back again, you know, on periodically, lots in the near future. And remember, mutual aid will get us through. Trust your neighbor, and talk to you soon. Bye for now.